Are we magically live?
You're live.
Am I in frame?
Well, yes, you are.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along. It's very nice to see you all. This is me giving. Last week it was proposed that I give a talk on some of the kind of social modelling stuff that I've been doing related to sort of civilizations and the sort of decline and fall, and it felt particularly pertinent given the stuff that happened in the election. So I sort of thought, yes, okay, let's do it. So this is me giving my talk. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel motivated. There should be the word highly in there. Highly motivated, because that's how I feel right now. And I'm going to be sharing a bunch of stuff I've done, complex systems research, specifically related to modelling of human social systems. Here's my talk outline. First of all, who I am. Second, what happened last week. Then where are we at now? What will happen next? And how can we make a difference? That's the notion behind the content talk. And here's my cheerful picture. Welcome to the future. Yes, there's that. Is that going to happen? We sincerely hope not. So who I am. Well, first and foremost, most people here at Cruzio know me as either one of two things: father of that, or the person who sits perched on the edge of the white table with the enormously overburdened set of peripherals and the ridiculously gigantic monitor screen. But I am more than both these two things. I am, in fact, also the author of these two books. Come on in. So yes, sometimes complex systems theorist, sometimes science fiction writer, definitely the owner of a large number of ridiculous peripherals, but there we go. So the reason why I'm giving this talk is I make models. Here is a whole slew of tremendously prestigious academic institutions, none of which have given me a qualification of any sort. But I have had the good fortune to collaborate as a person without a PhD with people at all of these different institutions. I got randomly caught up in a process of building complex systems models, mostly because my wife is a scientist, and I sort of got sucked through into this business of collaborating with it turns out, if you know a lot of scientists, there's a whole lot of scientists. If you can write computer code and you basically write free models and simulations for people, there are people who are very happy to sort of like tell you all kinds of things about interesting and exciting different bits of science. So I ended up at the end doing a brief stint as a complex systems theorist at Princeton, which was super fun and very unexpected. But so that's how come I'm modelling this stuff here, because a lot of the stuff that you'll be seeing is stuff that I was tinkering about when I did that. So what happened last week? Well, there's a lot of stuff. If you look online, there's a lot of theories flying about and notions about what happened in the election. We quote-unquote ignore the plight of the working class, except that we didn't, because there was, if you actually look at the statistics in terms of news stories, there was a huge number of stories attending to it. The whole Bernie Sanders movement was specifically related to that. That there was, a too high rate of social change, some people have said, and that everything was all becoming sort of, too much freedoms and rights and things too soon. I don't buy that. Because there are plenty of countries in the world that have sustained much, much higher levels of social change than the one that we've been experiencing recently. Another thing that people talk about is political complacency, the fact that people didn't get out and vote. Certainly, we could have had different people and more people getting out and voting. And so I think the political complacency, maybe some of it. Increasing corruption, there's been a lot, who's a crook and all of that sort of stuff been going on in the blogosphere, except that I really don't actually think, if you look at the statistics, that America is actually a corrupt country. In actual fact, we have some of the most extraordinarily low levels of corruption in the world. So I really don't think it's to do with corruption either. I think that there was a lot of people in the country who wanted to send a message to Washington. They were very angry because, they were quite rightly frustrated about people essentially, a wealthy urban financier class gambling with their money and throwing it away, and so they've decided to send a message to elect a New York casino magnate into the most powerful position in the entire country, and that's certainly an interesting way of sending a message. I personally suspect that there's something more going on here, because that seems to me to be an extremely bad decision. So I don't buy any of these rationales in isolation. I think there's something else going on. So what do I think is happening? Well, part of it is I studied animal decision making. So here we've got yaks or bison or what have you. We've got bees, we've got shoals of fish, all kinds of cool different species. And what's interesting about a lot of these different species is that their systems for making decisions are actually really similar. There's a fantastic bloke whose name is Ian Cousin, who works in until recently at Princeton, whose lab I got to visit a bunch of times. And one of his postdocs gave a talk in which he was sort of demonstrating an extraordinary fact, which is that the fewer the number of informed individuals in one of these kinds of social groups, the better the quality of the decision making, which seems counterproductive. Fewer informed individuals, better decision making. But it turns out that what happens is that if you have a few informed individuals and the information that they own or that they have could propagate through the group, then what happens is that propagation effect means that you have a few options that get escalated through the group. Essentially, there's a sort of an exponential growth curve of people making a particular decision, and it cancels out any noise that might arise in the system, and you end up with people making better choices. And I watched a talk on this, and I thought to myself, well, that's totally fascinating. But human beings don't mill around like bison or live in shoals of fish. Human beings tend to operate, particularly increasingly over time, in complicated social networks, particularly ones that are encoded via electronic media and the like. So I wondered, what happens if you take the same animal decision-making system and you put it on a social network? Well, the answer is you get horrendously bad collective decision-making. If you see over here, you've got what's called a well-mixed population, which is, if you take your sort of shoal of fish or your bees, where they're all milling around and meeting each other all of the time. The particular methodology that I described, where you have a few informed individuals, as you increase the size of the group but keep the number of informed individuals small, you get this incredible improvement in the quality of decision-making until it's almost perfect. Yes, Joanna?
Do you want questions along the way? Or
Sure, go for it.
How do you define a good decision? Did more bees live? Did more fish live? What's good?
Great question. So what I did for the purposes of my models is I started off with a tiny hand-picked mini group of informed individuals, and I had that 6 of them had sort of looked around for, let's say, a food source and decided, oh, that one's good, and 4 of them had found a food source that wasn't as good, and so somewhere in that group of 10 scouts they'd done some sampling, and 4 of them basically came to a lame choice. Only 6 of them came to a good choice. And so the question is then, but there's noise in the system. People can get the wrong idea. So the question then is, if you've got like thousands of bees in your hive or bison in your herd, how does the quality of the decision making change over time? So your scouts. So basically, the net assumption here is that the scouts have got it mostly right.
But I think the question was, in your model, what counts as how do you evaluate that the decision was good versus bad?
I assigned 6 agents at the beginning seed to having made a good choice, and 4 agents for having made a bad choice. I arbitrarily assigned it. I basically, because this is the same thing that shows up in the literature, I basically was looking to reproduce the kinds of mechanisms that show up in the modelling papers in the simplest possible way, and then look to see what happens when I put it on a social network. So what happens is, I played around with different kinds of networks. So there's different kinds of network that society's involved in. So the first thing I did was I swapped in a random network. So any node in the network is as likely to be connected to any other node as any other. And you'll see here that the green line for a random network comes up with pretty much the same result. So just putting agents on a network doesn't damage things on its own. What causes a problem is when you use what's called a scale-free network. The other kinds of social network, a small world network, which is another thing that happens in human social groups, isn't too hot either. But particularly, scale-free networks are a certain kind of network where you have a few hubs and a lot of nodes that don't really have many links going into them at all. And these networks show up all over the place in the kinds of systems that people build. So for instance, if you look at the structure of the physical internet, if you look at websites in the World Wide Web. So for instance, if you're going to choose which search engine to go to, you're more likely to go to Google than you are to go to DuckDuckGo. You might not even know that DuckDuckGo exists, a perfectly decent search engine, but more people you know will know about Google, and lots of people you know trust Google, so you're more likely to go to Google. So then Google ends up being a hub in that network with a whole bunch of links going into it. Whereas DuckDuckGo, perfectly decent, excellent search engine, doesn't get as much traffic, regardless of the quality of what they can bring to bear. So that's what happens in a scale-free network. We go to the things that we know. The people who are famous get more famous, and so on and so forth. So what we see here is that when we use a scale-free network, much like, for instance, Facebook or Twitter, what we see is that as we increase the size of the network, basically, even if we basically position our good scouts and our bad scouts at random across the network, we can show that the quality of the information making degrades over time. But then, if we take our system here, where we basically give those agents who have a bad idea, the ones who are propagating a bad notion, we give them the high value nodes, we put them on the hubs. We make the agents that have bad information, we make them the Google characters, put them in the center of the network, then the quality of the decision making drops off like that. Okay? So in putting ourselves on a structured social network, but leaving market economics to determine who's a hub, we've created this bizarre situation in which the quality of our decision making is way worse than bison or bees or yaks. We've basically locked ourselves into a ferocious storm of stupid. Amazing that we, the most sort of intelligent species notionally on the planet, were able to create a perfect storm of dim for ourselves. How do we manage to even pull that off? Well, there's a clue. Anyway, but here's a question also. How did we get really quite that bad? Because, you can ask a question about what are these kinds of messages that are being propagated? And why should I assume that the people who are sitting in the hub nodes of this network are propagating incorrect information? That's an assumption. Is it a fair assumption? Well, maybe not. We need to actually do a little bit more work in order to find out whether or not that's true. So I need to introduce you to two little ideas before I can come on to the next piece of research I did. One is the idea of prisoner's dilemma. And there are lots of big, wordy, complicated ways to describe prisoner's dilemma. But basically what it comes down to in biology and economics terms is, will you incur a small cost to do me a big favour if you don't know that I will ever repay it? So here we've got some monkeys engaged in a grooming activity. You've got a population of critters and, they're prone to getting lice. So will one member of that community invest the time and the effort to pick lice off of the other one without knowing that the other guy is likely, whether or not he's going to actually pick lice back off of his buddy? Because if both of these monkeys do it for each other, then they're both better off. If only one of the monkey engages in this friendly behaviour, the other one can say, "Great, thanks, see ya," and leaves the other guy with a sort of potentially sort of struggling with a blood disease or a sort of parasite infestation, and he's good to go and goes off and eats all the fruit. So we look for, when agents, people, monkeys, what have you, engage in a reciprocal process of looking after each other, we call that cooperation. If one of them basically sucks up a favour and doesn't repay it, we call that defecting. So there's one more thing I need to show you, which is wealth distribution curves. Because this is a tool that people use in economics. So here's one from Scotland, because Scotland is a responsible country that puts things like this on the internet so you can actually see. So here we have a bunch of different percentiles. So for each different wealth band in the country, we've gotten a different member of the population to stand on a pile of egg boxes or whatever, and the relative height of the egg boxes essentially gives you a picture of the curve of how the money is distributed through your population. So some people have a lot of money. A lot of people don't have so much, but these kinds of curves will show up in a lot of societies. And the curves are usually much steeper at one end than people ever imagine. People imagine there's a kind of something approximately linear, but no, it doesn't look like that. But anyway, the idea is I wanted to give you a sense of the picture of what these things look like. So then here is the interesting piece of research I did, and this is essentially how lies spread. Now there's a thing that happens when people model populations where they look at a bunch of these agents, they build a bunch of software robots to behave like monkeys, and they get them to cooperate or not cooperate, and they see what kinds of behaviors dominate. So I built a bunch of digital monkeys and I put them in a box together, and what I did is I wanted to see whether or not how much wealth, if you like, how fit, my digital robots were, whether or not the level of wealth that a particular agent had was some kind of a good indicator for whether or not you should cooperate with it. So you've got a choice here of whether or not you can trust and cooperate with people who are richer than you, trust and cooperate with people who are like yourself, wealth-wise, or trust and cooperate with the poor. So, this is charity, this is currying favour with the local head fund manager, and this is basically sort of like helping peeps in Cruzioworks. So then we just let nature take its course, and if we just let pure evolution, pure market dynamics, if you like, sort of hold court and look at what happens. So basically what's going to happen is these bars are going to change height to make a wealth distribution curve. So, and you can see at the moment these strategies are randomly distributed. Yes?
I want to ask before we see the answer. So cooperate, because you started this with prisoner's dilemma, we don't know anything about even reciprocity. So cooperate with the rich means I will incur a small cost to do a favor upwards in wealth distribution.
Right.
I will so we just know you set it up. It's a one-way street. I will do something this way. Is that right?
Actually, the way it's particularly built on this simulation is I've got all my robots in a bag, and I shake the bag and I randomly pick out 2 robots, and then they look at each other, and then they assess, how rich or poor do you look compared to me, and they make a decision about how they're going to interact with each other. They choose to cooperate or defect. I bang the robots together to see how they behave, and there's some transfer of wealth, there's some pattern that happens, they cooperate or they don't cooperate, and they either make some money or lose some money depending upon how they behave, and then the robots come away either feeling happy or sad. I pop them back in the bag, shake the bag again, and pack out another 2 robots, and I just iterate like that. So
and the rules say that they will both cooperate when they're peers.
They can choose. The robots basically, they pick. Each robot has a different strategy, but the strategies that are most successful are the ones that are going to increase in frequency. So basically, really powerful strategies are likely to get copied by other agents. If they get too frustrated, they're going to change their mind and think, that person's doing better than me, I'm going to do what they're doing. So then we look and see what happens. So do people want to have a guess first? What do they think is going to happen? What kind of strategy do you think is likely to succeed and win under these conditions?
Cooperate with rich.
What's that, sorry?
Cooperate with the rich.
Do you think cooperate with the rich is going to succeed? Okay. And what do you think?
I'll go with cooperate with the peers.
Yeah.
Cooperate with peers.
I'll say that
Peers.
too. Yeah.
What do you think cooperate with peers?
Cooperate with peers.
Here's what happens. So you see, there's cooperating with peers. It's getting forced out. There's cooperating with the poor. It's getting forced out too.
Wow.
Cooperate with the rich is dominating, as Colin correctly guessed. So then we have this blue band sitting over here.
Why do you say that was a guess?
So we're basically seeing that a large number of these agents are sliding into poverty down at this end. So they're getting poorer and poorer. In actual fact, what's interesting is the strategy that's dominating is indeed cooperate with the rich. It's making everybody poor except a tiny number of agents. So how can it possibly be succeeding? You might ask yourself, what's going on with this? And the answer is that the strategy cooperate with the rich paradoxically works, because what happens is if a few agents have this strategy at the beginning, they defect against everybody else, because at the beginning everyone has approximately the same level of wealth. But then they are still looking like they're still looking successful. So they encourage other people around them. You know what you should be doing? You should be copying me, which is basically just cooperate with the rich. And so what happens is that they actually do even better than the people who just defect against everybody and steal stuff from everybody in the system. They never return a favor, because the people who essentially propagate the strategy of, you know what, you should do something for the people in society who are most powerful, that strategy ends up sitting at the top, even though the entire system basically slowly slides south. Because the fact that they are sitting in control of the media, if you like, they are most able to propagate their strategy, means that they make out like bandits. I call this the Fox News effect. So there you see, that's effectively how misinformation is able to spread in the system. It's a strategy that's good only for a tiny number of agents, and yet it dominates under this regime. So what's the ideal strategy? What should we do? Well, cooperate by default. Cooperating makes everybody better. I've rerun the system where basically if you force a strategy and you look to see which strategies actually are most effective for everybody, we had also, at the back there were some recommendations of cooperate with peers. That is the best collective strategy by far. In actual fact, you should be the most cautious with people who are very much richer than yourself. Those are the people who are most likely to be defectors in the system, as we have seen. And the other thing is, as we saw before, never rely on structured social networks for your information. Just don't. Because structured social information networks, as we've seen, destroy information. So where are we at now? So let's build a simulation. I put one together this week when I knew I was going to do this talk. I wanted to put something together that I thought would say something about our current situation. So I built a new simulation where I put everybody in a social network, and I made it local, at least at the beginning, not random or scale free as we've seen. I'm basically giving people a choice between agriculture or industry, because what I wanted there's a lot that's come up in this election about the people who used to work in factories, about notional making America great again, and what happens when there's industry, what happens when industry goes away. I wanted to build a model that would paint a picture of that. I wanted to also paint a picture of what happens when industry goes to the most competitive, because of course there's lots of people who've talked about the idea of jobs going off to China. I wanted to try and build a model about that. And I also wanted to put in here the fact that in order for somebody to put a factory somewhere, information about how that factory has to actually have arrived in that place. They have to have the knowledge and the know-how to put that in. And also the idea that with wealth, of course, comes freedom. And the freedom to choose who you're going to interact with. And of course, that's another thing that's been driving a lot of the debate of late. So I created a sim which I've called the Industrial Revolution. So here we've got a wealth distribution curve on this side, which is at the moment it's all green, as you can see. Yes.
Is your Industrial Revolution coal powered, or is it?
Well, good question. That's an excellent question. At the moment, my Industrial Revolution is actually super simple. All there is really in this Industrial Revolution is mining, if you like, mining some magical resource that imparts power. So let's say it's basically digging for oil. That's what we've got, mining for magic power crystals. So we start off with a social network of agents over here, and at the moment they've all got the same amount of money. This looks like just a block of stuff, but these all agents that essentially have the same amount of money. And we can see down here is what's called a Gini coefficient, which is a number that sociologists use to sort of, can you see it? There's just a zero there. I'll read it out for people who can't see. But essentially down there you've got a number that's essentially a measure of inequality. So we've got a 0, that basically says your society is very, very equal. If you've got a 1, that suggests your society is maximally unequal. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this, and we're going to invent industry, and then attempt to watch the Industrial Revolution in high speed, because we can do that with the simulation. We can take some tiny facet of human society and then race it forward at a ludicrous pace. Right, here we go. Wealth distribution curve goes from totally initial settings to something like normal, and then look over here. Blue indicates people are mining. Red indicates people who've mined out their stuff. They've run out of resources already. But look over here. The people who have the most amount of money are not the people who are digging it out of the ground. They're the people who recently were digging it out of the ground and have now moved on to a quote-unquote service economy. And as this spreads, and you see now most of the stuff has been mined out, you see that you've got this interesting curve over here. The people who previously lived in a part of the network where mining was happening now have the lion's share of the money. And there's a few people still in agriculture, of course, they're locked down into teeny tiny parts of the network. But look at this, we've got this Gini coefficient here of 0.3. That's pretty good. So despite the fact that we do have a bunch of people up here who are somewhat richer than others. It doesn't look a million miles away from Scotland that we saw in the previous slide. So at some level you can look here, we've got this incredible sort of blurry mess of connections. The other thing is because everyone can connect to everybody else now across the network, people can decide who they're going to connect to based upon huge aeroplane distances that go right across the square tabletop-shaped planet. So down here you see, there's some people still doing farming. There's still a few people doing farming, of course, but for the most part we've got a service economy, and the people who were quite close to the beginning of that service economy are now doing extremely well. So that's at least our vanilla picture. You can ask, is that honest? And also you can ask, would we have been better off if the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened? Well, let's go find out. Would the world be better without machines if we had remained in an agrarian setting? Let's press the button and see what that looks like. So here we go. Once again, we've got this developmental curve. We've got the network moving. People can't build up quite as long connections between each other because it requires spending an awful lot of time on horseback. But what we have over here is we've got our sort of wealth distribution curve over here. But look, the fact that we don't have an industrial revolution essentially doesn't stop some people from dominating the wealth for themselves. They've still got kings in their castles and lords of the manor and people out there digging turnips. So in actual fact, as this thing progresses, lo and behold, we don't have these sort of industrial effects, we don't have that propagating wave, but we actually end up with a worse wealth distribution than when we put industry in. So on the face of it, that seems to suggest that there is some inherent net value in what we've done with our society, the building of the factories. But you might sort of say, well, this seems a little bit glossy and optimistic right now, Alex, and you'd be so right. Because it isn't just a sort of a magical one-way thing where we sort of dig wealth out of the ground and that's just it. In actual fact, we all do live increasingly, particularly in the West, in what is laughably referred to as a service economy, which means no industry anymore. We've coupled together these two things of like some people being waitstaff and some people being hedge fund managers, glued them together into a single, rather badly defined category and called it service industry, which is great so long as you're a hedge fund manager. So the truth of the matter is industrialization does have consequences. People who lose money do get angry, and the clock does not go backwards, because once your river looks like this, growing crops up and down the side of it is harder to do than it formerly was. So we might sort of say, well, what happens if we build another model? Why would we put these kinds of factors in? Well, we can do that too, because simulations are easy to build. So here we go, with a little bit more realism. Now what happens? Okay, once again, we've got our propagating system. Now I've coloured angry people in yellow. So you can see little flashes of anger. And what happens is when people lose money and they've got less money than they used to have, then lo and behold, and as you get a lot of sort of anger in here because people who have less money than they did previously and bad things happen to them, they get frustrated because they remember how good things used to be. But also bear in mind, there's still some yellow people, and then occasionally the people who are frustrated will lash out and try and take something from somebody else. So we've tried to put in the capacity for sort of violence into the system. Notice, being rich doesn't stop you from being angry. You can be somebody who has less money than you formerly did, all the way up at the top of the food chain. And then when you look around for a victim, there are a very large number of people below you in wealth level who all look like they've got less money for you, who you would like to sort of reach out and zap. Also, you'll sort of see there's this interesting difference in the network here. That basically, as we run the simulation this time, there's a gap. As this flow, there's a wave started here, but now this area is quite dark. In actual fact, the people who hit industry last are the people who are doing better, and the people who hit industry first are the people who are now losing out. Now, what I did in this model is I made sure that the environmental effects hit at random across the network. So in other words, if I dig a giant oil well here, maybe there's a horrible thunderstorm over here. So it can't just be down to environmental degradation in this model that's causing it to burn out. It has to be to do with the spread of anger and frustration and the consequences that that has on people's wealth generation. We've got two questions. Yes?
The line there, what does that represent?
That's basically, if you like, the amount of money that people started off with. So at this point, what we started off, the purple line in the first one you saw, the purple line sort of stayed about here because at least about half of the people had less money, but the money was concentrated. But in this, because we've mined stuff out of the ground, the amount of net wealth that's available has gone up. So this purple line has been pressed quite close to the bottom of the screen. Now, what I've assumed in this is it's something optimistic about the climate. I presume that something around 40 to 50% of the value of digging things up and inventing with them is retained, despite the environmental consequences. People might turn around and say, well, no, actually, what you should be looking is, that it should be 120% of the cost of digging out of the ground, which would maybe produce a different kind of model again. But what I wanted to do was keep it relatively conservative and relatively optimistic, and then see whether or not we could still see the patterns of change in the network, which we see in our social system. And lo and behold, we are still getting these post-industrial gaps, even though we're being quite optimistic about what digging things out of the ground does for our society. But once again, we've got a very, very simple social model. But you'll see our Gini curve here is still not too bad. It's still better than the agrarian society that never dug anything out of the ground in the first place. But there's something else here, because when people get angry, they don't get angry in isolation like we just saw. And also when people look around for victims, they do look around, generally speaking, for victims who are less wealthy or less powerful than themselves. This is a sort of a common pattern which we've seen repeated in history a great number of times. So what I would propose is, in actual fact, a mechanism via which human beings aggregate into highly motivated social groups is actual fact a lot simpler than we imagine. We imagine that because we have incredibly complicated brains, that our behavior is therefore complex. I would propose that this is not necessarily always the case. Sometimes it's true, but anybody who's been stuck in a traffic jam will tell you that the room for agency where you're sitting in a traffic jam is limited. Having a complicated brain does not mean that your net behavior is complex. There's to be these guiding principles that determine how people behave. So what I propose is that when people choose to aggregate, they basically look around and they say, do I feel like I'm doing worse than I formerly was? Then they look around and they say, do I see others like me who seem to be losing too? And bear in mind, if you're on a structured social network, this is the easiest thing in the world, because you're likely to aggregate with specifically those people. And then what you also do is you look around and you say, what leader can I see that looks both strong, so in other words, likely to engage in some kind of, fighting or particularly game theoretically speaking, defecting behavior on my behalf, and also popular. Because if you're trying to assess somebody who is a social defector to lead you, the last thing you want to do is pick somebody who's basically just a car thief. You want to look around for somebody, so you can't trust them to tell you whether or not you should trust them. The only people you can trust are other people's attitudes, so people who you would cooperate with. How do they feel about that social defector? So what you're looking for is somebody who is popular, who you know has the ability to lie. So let's say there's someone on TV, and they seem to be lying a lot, but they also seem to be really popular. And what happens is other people point to say, but he's a liar. And then that person says, everybody loves me, which is more likely to dominate. Everybody loves me is more likely to dominate than he's a liar, because of course when people are frustrated, they're looking for a social defector. They're seeking out that person who's going to lead them. And the reason why I put this picture of these funny blobs up here is there's this extraordinary kind of species called the slime mold. These individual cells that drift around like amoebae, on logs and stuff like that, like eating little bits of nutrient. And they do that on their own until such time as food gets scarce. And then they do this amazing thing, which is they aggregate into a slug. They irreversibly turn themselves into a macroscopic animal, something that you can see. And then they travel around like a slug until they find a good place to reproduce, and they make a kind of a mushroom. And then some of the cells in the slime mold basically sit at the bottom, and they send up a sort of a stalk, and then the ones that happen to be sitting at the top, at the sort of head of the stalk, they reproduce, and all the other cells in the mushroom die. But some of those slime mold cells get to live despite the fact that food is getting scarce. So I think that same pattern of aggregation in times of scarcity happens on a whole bunch of different scales. And the fact that we have complicated brains does not stop us from behaving like slime molds when we perceive social scarcity. The difference for us is that we pick a social defector to aggregate around. And so And the interesting thing is social defectors always tend to look the same. They always tend to look like really strong, popular social defectors every single time. And there's also another factor of this is a reason why it's always immigrants, and that is that immigrants or interloping social groups of some sort generally have less money than you. Those are the people you're likely to be able to predate upon. And there's some very simple food logic here. Let's say you're a part of a community and you've been doing really well. You've been accumulating all these food resources and getting, wealthier and stronger, and happier and more powerful. And then all of a sudden your resources start to thin out and you're doing less well than you were before. At that point you're going to think, things are not so good as they were before. I'm on an up. And then the first thing you do is you look around for somebody who's not. Because if you have an advantage and you want to maintain your advantage, the simple game theoretic thing to do is to look for somebody who has less advantage than you and take all their stuff. If you choose somebody who has more stuff than you, your chance of beating them is significantly less. What you're going to do is you're going to look around for the person who's an easy victim. And you're going to say, I have a right and a justification for taking all of their things. And that's what you're going to do. So once again, that part of the message of those people over there are responsible for the fact that I'm not doing as well as I was also always shows up in the same pattern. It's not that complicated. It's something that happens with a slightly more level of complexity. But then you might ask, given that we have all this tribalism, what happens next? Wouldn't it be nice if we had something a little bit like a crystal ball, who was able to scroll forward and show the development of human societies, like the Game of Thrones credit sequence, with the little machines and the towers going up and so on and so forth? Well, as it turns out, fortunately, we can, because we have the power of simulations, and each simulation is just a few pages of code. They're easy to build. So once again, we're going to borrow a little bit of game theory, and we're going to put stuff in and see what happens. So I've got another simulation here. This time I'm going to deliberately put agents in tribes. I'm going to have the agents exchanging money with each other. I'm going to have them exercise political will. And this time it's going to be a very simple kind of political will. It's going to be the decision, do I want to spend a little bit of my money maintaining a tax, if you like, to keep a lid on white-collar crime? So basically, am I going to police the bankers or not? That's the only thing that gets taxed in this society. Some agents want to cheat, but they're only going to cheat if opportunity exists in their society. And the fact that they want to cheat on a slide does not necessarily mean that they're always going to vote for the brakes to come off of society. Maybe these are people who would sort of if they think other people are cheating, they're going to cheat, but so long as everybody else is obeying the law, they're going to do the same thing. And also tribes can merge or split. So in other words, if you build an empire and you go crush your neighbours, you can fold them into your culture and then your society. Or let's say that you've got a great balance of trade and there's a little country next door that's like, do please take us over because we'll be doing better if we're a part of you. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is done by war, but what I am suggesting is that societies can merge together, either like the Roman Empire or the European Union or anything in between. Right, so here we've got our tribes and our people burning money and our crazy people coming out of boats with spears in their hand. So let's go and look. And so here I've tried to make this simulation look something like a political map. So here we have a whole bunch of tribes in tabletop land. And each one of these little dots here is a village in tabletop land. And so the ones who have blue around the edges are the people who are paying police tax. The ones with yellow around the edges are the people who are like, I don't think we should have to pay that. They keep that money to generate prosperity. So they're like, why are we doing this ludicrous thing? People are fundamentally good, aren't they? We don't need to police people. White hat are basically the people who are, they wouldn't cheat even under the most extreme circumstances. They're totally pure. Black hats are the people where if you push them hard enough, yeah, they'll bend the rules. And then red dots are basically villages that just don't have any money. And then over here, dots that are little are poor, and dots that are big are rich. So then we can press the button on this model, and we can see what happens. Here we go. Or not. Yeah, okay, here we go.
So what do the
So
products of the
we're scrolling forward through a very large number of years, 1 year per sort of like fraction of a second here. We're scrolling through time. We've got Roman empires forming. Some of these little villages are becoming towns and are becoming powerful. We've got some places where these areas are sort of empires are falling because what happens is some really dodgy oligarchs get into power and they suppress wealth creation. And, you know, so over here we have some countries doing badly. Countries that do well tend to be the ones that maintain the rule of law and tend to maintain enough of a wealth tax that they basically are holding their system together because they prosper the generation of iteration rather than suppressing it. Because if you're already in control of the wealth, the last thing you want is for somebody else to be trying to build a fortune that might contest yours. So we see what happens is that we're seeing the rise of the secular West. We're seeing basically the rule of law and organized social institutions come in. Look, we've gone to a golden age. There's two empires here, but they're both holding on to the rule of law. They both believe in looking after their people. And something's happened. Oh, they had a little fissure. They decide they didn't get along with each other. So wait, one of those groups was run by a bunch of dodgy oligarchs. Oh, and so they fledged. But never mind, they've got it back together again. And then, oh no, the dodgy oligarchs got back into power. And, what's happening now? That's grim. Oh, it's almost as if as soon as we had a single unified global empire, we went into a state of lockdown poverty, and it's not recovering. Ooh, goodness, that's eerie. Oh, there we go, we've gotten to the end of the simulation, and it's poverty everywhere. What happened? How come we had a golden empire where prosperity was being generated and everyone was respecting the rule of law, and then this happened to it? And the answer is, while there were individual little countries that were competing with each other, there was an incentive for people to do good. Because the countries that did good together kept their act together. The countries that did not do good were the ones that lost out. But every governmental system, regardless of its intent, is at some level capable of being cheated and gamed out by some group of oligarchs who are seeking to control wealth generation. So at the point at which we fused it into a single tabletop-wide empire, we removed the incentive for people to cooperate. So as soon as you have a global society, peace on earth, one group of people, you create a perfect storm situation for a single group of crooks to game the system out. And of course they do this thinking they're going to get themselves rich. Big picture, they're as poor as everybody else because they've taken the brakes off and they've suppressed wealth creation and the system can't go back because now it's a tightly coupled system. So that's interesting, isn't it? Now, of course, this is just a simulation. This is just one picture of the future. This is a tiny, teeny tabletop model. Does this mean that we're screwed? I don't think so. I think there are things that we can do, ladies and gentlemen. And there's an upside to all of this. So let's go on and talk about that. But first, let's talk about how robust this model is. I don't like this model because it keeps working. No matter when I spend a lot of this week tweaking around with how this model worked and looking at different outcomes because it's painfully robust. All you need is trade. The fact that it's easier for societies to merge than it is to split. So it's easier for groups to get together than it is for some part of them to secede away. Like, you know, if you look at the madness around Brexit right now, you see that even when a group decides, all right, we have a well-defined identity and we want to separate, it's not that easy. You know, no matter what your intent may be, it's just not that simple. And also, the capacity for crime needs to be latent in the system. As long as you have these ingredients, this result seems to just keep popping up in a way that has caused me to lose a certain amount of sleep. Because then you can ask the question, well, when is it coming? This giant eerie merging effect. And the answer is, you may be watching it happen now. Because the system reaches this critical state, you start to get these weird volatile effects. What you need is a unified global financial and political system in place. Once you have those things, the system is essentially becoming tightly coupled, and it's extremely hard to go backwards. Now, once again, I remain an optimist. I think there are things that we can do about this. And it's not necessarily the case that this model is true and correct, but certainly we are, as evidenced by the surprises that we're getting in politics in Britain and in America, that we are at an interesting inflection point in history. Yes?
So, like when we had the housing bubble and the entire world economies collapsed everywhere.
That's right, exactly. Tightly coupled system. You're seeing one of these big stochastic jags that happen because we've joined the whole system together. And now it's even more coupled together than it was before. So you might ask the question, well, why haven't I heard about this effect? You know, there are a lot of macroeconomic specialists with tools that are surely better than mine, right? Well, so what I would say is that scientists tend to publish results that they are confident about. That's what it means to be a scientist. You do rigorous work, and then you publish the thing that you are very confident about. But confidence requires predictability. It requires that you look at a system and then figure out what you know, and then you publish that. But here's the thing. Critical systems are not predictable. What I mean by that is there's this thing called self-organized criticality that shows up in nature. So in other words, it's business as usual in the forest, and things grow and you can go hiking in the woods until it catches fire. And then you've got to a system that's reached a critical inflection point, and it's burning, and suddenly that hiking trail that you were going to go on this weekend is not available, at least unless you're wearing a very large asbestos suit. Earthquakes too are critical systems. What happens is tension builds up at a place in the ground, and then the land shifts. It's a critical change, and then tension is spread out into other parts of the system, and then tension builds up there. And interestingly, we do have enough results to know that human conflict, the rise and fall of empires, follows exactly the same critical distribution curves, the same scale-free effects that show up for forest fires and for earthquakes. People have done the math. They know the human conflict is a system that experiences self-organized criticality. But all of the macroeconomic tools that we are currently using are predicated on conditions that happen before global merging is complete. Because they're all based on prior knowledge we have about what trade agreements do, what currency unions do, and all of that sort of stuff. You put everybody in the same bucket, the incentive patterns are completely different from what they were before. Okay, interesting times. So you might say, yes, but these are only simulations, and you'd be dead right. They are only simulations. This is just a guess about the future. It's a call to action, if you like. It's a motivating factor that if we can predict something looks like this, we should certainly be doing something about it now. You can say that sims are simple and people are complicated, and that's true some of the time, but it's also not true some of the time. You put people in a dirty grey crowd, and lo and behold, your degrees of freedom are constrained. So crowds behave like crowds, traffic jams behave like traffic jams. Ask yourself how much political autonomy you feel like you have this week in the events that, oops, I've gone backwards, in the events that have happened. And you can ask yourself whether or not you're operating in a system where your autonomy is constrained or not. Because if it is, you need to start exercising agency and intelligence quickly. Now you might sort of say, but the world keeps changing, right? Because there's AI and there might be a singularity and all that, and that's true too. But also those factors are very volatile right now. We have to look and sort of say, if we want to protect the environment, the same exact logic applies to if we want to protect our political reality. So arguably, the fact that these things, that there are limitations on how much is true or what we can do with models, doesn't mean that there aren't really good reasons for us to get together and do something effective and meaningful. But what's the big solution? Well, there is one system that means that that model never ever reaches that dark place. It just carries on being awesome. And that's if you put fraud-proof obstacles between human populations. You turn it into a loosely coupled system so that you can't make the whole thing bundle together into a single unified mess. And what that does is it limits the scale of human suffering, because you can only have, when disasters happen to one group of people, when there's a dodgy election and some guy who can't finish a sentence suddenly gets in charge, there's only so much that can go wrong. And it also ensures that no disaster can take everyone, and also, most interestingly, creates incentives for democracy everywhere. When competition is still going on, there's an incentive for everyone to still keep their act together. So, what does that look like? What does fraud-proof obstacles between human populations mean? What is a fraud-proof obstacle? Well, that's an open question. I have one answer so far, one big answer as to what fraud-proof obstacle looks like, and that is space. If you want peace on Earth, try making a spare one here. My point is that if you put people in places that are hard to get to, you recreate exactly the circumstances that existed in places like ancient Greece, where you had to get in a boat to go from one island to the next. You create the perfect situation in which democracy can persist and remain strong. Now, doing this is hard. Doing this is a buttload of work. Let's be honest. It feels to most people like science fiction. But it's also, one has to remember that it was not that long ago that the idea of President Trump was a joke that was being busted out on The Simpsons. Not a piece of, reality that people expected to have happen. We have entered a science fictional time, and so arguably we should be starting to think, both in the small and in the large, about solutions on a range of different scales. Yes?
Well, you just touched on it, the range of scales. If we can expend the effort to build a base on Mars, we're looking at a population on Mars that is 6 orders of magnitude smaller than
Absolutely
here.
right.
And if shit happens here, they're out of luck.
That's absolutely
you wind
right.
up with one dump. It's like you're trying to break the influence of an absolutely dominant country by taking over an oil derrick.
Right. Yes, it's completely correct. This is an absolutely true point. The point is that we have to start trying. Like, for instance, one thing that we could do is put people in Antarctica. That's a lot easier than doing it here. Put people at the South Pole in a place that's hard to reach. Start building colonies. Every colony we build is going to start small.
My point
Every
is
place that's hard to get to where we put people is going to have a very few people in it until it gets established. Yes?
My point is that your model assumes that everyone starts with resources. In this case of Mars or even Antarctica or an oil derrick, they have none. They are completely dependent upon the larger society.
That's absolutely true, which is why the big solution, the long-term solution, cannot be the only solution. There has to be more than this. This is a piece of it. This is the big long-term thing that we can do to secure humanity's future big picture. It's not what we can do here in Cruzio, and I'm going to come on to that, because that is an important part of the equation as well. The point is, we cannot afford to have this be science fiction. We have to put it on the stack of real things that we are thinking about as a species. But it's not everything, because you're dead right. This is something that would take an enormous amount of time for us to sort of even turn into a remotely viable proposition. So there's my call to action. But, so thank you for coming on to this. I think that there are things that we can do in the small scale right now. Right now in this room. We don't have to put all of our investment and energy into thinking about sending people to Mars. There's stuff that we can do this week. The first thing you can do is ditch Facebook and tell your friends why. Because what we've seen is the consequences of letting highly structured social networks define our collective decision making, and it's terrifying. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that basically you're getting your information from many different places. Get it from your neighbours. The best information and the most unifying information is the information that comes locally, that comes through places like this, where people are investing and making money together and building something together. So sample multiple news sources. Trust none of them absolutely. Work locally. Concentrate on your local community. Concentrate on your local environment. Help the people you know is one of the best things you can do, because remember, cooperating with your peers, with the people you work with every day, the best way to generate prosperity. And also, reject bullies. So the interesting thing here is, if you look at how human beings pick out victims, we are more like mountain lions than we are like bears. I don't know if people are familiar with the idea that, if you meet a bear in the wild, look small, look non-threatening, so the bear doesn't swipe you. If you get to a mountain lion, you want to look as big as possible, so that they're less likely to call you lunch. So human beings are more like mountain lions than they are like bears. If you see a group in your community that you want to protect, the aim is to help them look strong, help them look like not victims, and then those people are much, much likely to do better. And also, get involved in science. We can't all go to Mars next week. We can't all go to Mars and establish that within the next 500 years, to the excellent point that was made. But everyone can get involved in pushing back the frontiers of science. And so the last thing that I want to say with this call to action is talk about 2 projects that I myself am involved in, that I would love to make sure that everybody knows exist, that I personally am passionate about. I would encourage everyone to pick their own methodology, pick their own way of getting involved in science, but here are 2 things that I care about that I've started. And if people want to talk to me about them afterwards, I'd be very happy to talk to discuss them. So one of them is fun jitsu. Now, I've been trying to put together workshops with Joanna Nelson, who's sitting over here, who's awesome. And what we refer to this is as the martial art for social intelligence. And what we mean by this is essentially icebreaker games on steroids. I used to do a whole bunch of improv theatre, and I was an improv instructor. And I had the great good fortune to work with a group of people at UCSC teaching communication skills to academics. And we developed a whole toolkit where there was no stage stuff, there was no standing up on stage being funny, it was just a series of icebreaker games. But we actually got to the point where we were able to cause people to go from being very shy to going on and winning awards for their public speaking. The one guy in the group who had a chronic stutter, and after he'd been doing this stuff for 10 weeks, his stutter was gone. Not just in the workshop, but just gone. When he stopped doing the exercises, of course, the stutter came back. But the fact is that there is a toolkit that we've been developing, and the idea is that what we did up at UCSC is we turned it into a mechanism via which people can play games and analyse their own behaviour. They can basically do the opposite of Facebook, where they just have information pumped at them. Instead, they can do a little experiment as a group, figure out how they themselves are interacting, and then from that, choose what tools that they are going to use to empower themselves and their communities. And all you need to do that is just the ability to have fun, the ability to move around as a room, and maybe some chairs. No science background, no nothing. Just showing up for a couple of hours and having a laugh and laughing. So if people are interested, please come and let me know. And the other thing is a wonderful project that I have going with Ethan, this magnificent man back in the corner over here. And this guy does the most incredibly beautiful computer graphics for movies and all manner of exciting projects and things. Some of the most gorgeous computer graphics I've ever seen. And I'm working with him to try to take some of the simulation ideas that you've seen here and some other ones about the environment, sustainability, you name it, and basically turn these things into highly interactive simulations that we can put into public spaces, so we can get the message out, so that we can even chuck something onto the wall of a building or some such thing, and get people engaged in a public dialogue about simulations and about science that's easy to do and easy for everyone to get engaged in. Because I honestly believe that if everybody is able to understand the forces that are shaping their own decision making and the forces that determine their own prosperity, we will together make better decisions and be a more happy, functional, robust society. And then we'll be able to go on and do our crazy stretch goals, like put people on Mars. But we have to do this stuff first. We have to think about looking after each other. We have to basically make sure we're making sensible decisions, and then we have to also get engaged in making sure that everybody is as informed and as empowered as we can possibly get them. So that's basically it. That's the end of my talk. A huge thanks to all of you for coming along. So everybody, a round of applause for absolutely everybody. Thank you for coming and listening to my loopy message. That's basically it. Anybody got any remaining questions here at the end, or things that they want to sort of chuck in?
Well,
yes.
I personally don't buy the notion of Facebook, because there's always going to be a tool. It's more about education. It's more about the second point, that read news from multiple sources. I mean, there's always going to be something like Facebook. It's more about just knowing that taking stuff with a grain of salt.
That's absolutely true. So basically, do not trust those sources. That's absolutely right. It is also true, though, that if you look at how those companies have the kinds of network that they have created, we can make a choice about which of those resources we go to. So Facebook specifically, the reason why I have a bee in my bonnet about Facebook is they made an active choice a few years ago that they were going to own news. So they basically decided that what they were going to do was try to suck up the advertising revenue that they saw Google getting. So they decided to make their site the tool for propagating information socially. So they started sculpting the content of everybody's feeds so they could maximize the propagation of quote-unquote news stories with viral potential. So they created a perfect storm for very short memes, and they deliberately left the brakes off in terms of what was the informational content of those messages, because they left it open to the profit motive in terms of wanting to generate advertising revenue, regardless of the political and social consequences of essentially creating very, very short messages that essentially just cause people to click and send to all of their friends. So what I would say is that yes, you're dead right, something like social media will always exist, but it is also true that we can make decisions, we can make informed, active choices about which one of those social media tools we want to use. Some kinds of social media can use a mesh, neighborhood.com for instance. There are other kinds of social media tools which will connect you with people who have likes in common who you don't know yet. So we can choose how we want to shape our social network and whether or not we want it to be something that helps inform and empower people or something that just makes somebody else a buck. Because if we do that, what we'll end up doing is degrading the quality of information that everybody has. So certainly I don't expect anyone to go and shut down their Facebook accounts, absolutely. I expect them to do what you just said, which is take it with a grain of salt. But I think that we need to exercise more agency than that. Yes, Ethan.
Yeah. I think well, first of all, the Mars analogy, it was physical distance, and what we're talking about mostly here is informational distance.
Right.
Okay, and then it made me think of a great comedy that was on TV for a while on Netflix called Arrested Development.
Yes.
Okay, remember all that one? Well, so one of the characters in that developed something called face block. And so the idea is that you can block out people, right, where you can block